For many wrestlers, the peak of what they can hope to achieve in the industry isn't to win a world title. No, it's to main event WrestleMania. After all, only a select few people can ever say that they've achieved such a feat. And this means some of the biggest legends in the wrestling industry have never gotten the chance to headline the grandest stage of them all. But who are the most notable examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the man of the hour, CM Punk. Yes, if there's ever been one guarantee about the incredibly unpredictable world of wrestling over the last few years, it's that CM Punk will always remain a topic of conversation. And with his recent return to WWE at November 26, 2023's Survivor Series, there's only been additional focus put back onto the reasons behind his exit the first time around. Now, we're not trying to suggest the main reason Punk left WWE in 2014 was because he hadn't main evented WrestleMania yet, but it was certainly a factor in his frustrations. Hell, you could argue there were multiple occasions when he should have gone on last at the Showcase of the Immortals, such as in 2012 or 2013, when he was the most over act in the company. Unfortunately though, both of those years would see the main event spot be taken up by the twice-in-a-lifetime bout that was John Cena versus The Rock. And given the Great One was only a part-timer by this point, the fact that he got to go on last was a particular sticking point for the Second City Saint. Hell, he said as much during his pipe bomb, in fact. And this is something which has evidently stuck with him over the years following, because after being fired from AEW in 2023, he's since returned to WWE. Will he finally get the WrestleMania main event he so desperately wants this time around? There's certainly a better chance now, as with the show taking place over 2 nights, there's double the opportunity. Of course, this double opportunity hasn't seen everyone who deserves it get such a spot though, and if you don't believe us, you only have to look to our next subject, Bayley, as evidence that we're right about that. Honestly, if you really sat down and thought about it, there'd be a good case to be made that Bayley is the most underrated and underappreciated wrestler in all of WWE. After all, she's been the glue which has held the company's women's division together at various points. It doesn't matter if it was during the lockdown where alongside Sasha Banks she was keeping things afloat, during her run as the leader of Damage Control where she gave some life back to the stagnant SmackDown scene, or during her time as the face of NXT after the other 3 horsewomen had left to join the main roster. So the fact Banks, Becky Lynch, and Charlotte Flair have all main evented WrestleMania and she hasn't is a true crime then, as the Bay Area native deserves such an accolade just as much as they do. Really, if WWE were to convince the boss to return to the company at some point, then the obvious choice would be to have all 4 of them close out the show with a fatal 4-way match. Will this actually happen though? That remains to be seen, as there's equally as good a chance Mercedes Moné goes to AEW as things stand currently. But even if it doesn't work out, Bayley still deserves the main event spot sooner rather than later anyway, as she's absolutely put in the work over the years required to earn it. If Triple H really wanted to, he'd have a great excuse to have her headline Night 1 in 2024, as it looks like she's in the process of being pushed out of Damage Control and turning babyface in the process. So having her challenge Io Sky for the WWE Women's title in April would make all the sense in the world. But even if this is the case, she still has competition for that spot, as there's another woman on the roster who's gotten massively over during the last year or two. Who are we talking about here? Why, Rhea Ripley, of course. That's right, few people in WWE have ever risen as highly as quickly as the Nightmare has. Hell, at this point, she's arguably bigger than the entire women's division. Seriously, while she currently reigns as the Women's World Champion over on Raw, it almost seems like that's her side gig at points, as her main focus has been on serving as the unofficial leader of the Judgment Day and overall anchor of everything that's taking place on the Red brand. So given how crucial a part of the show she is then, it's a wonder she hasn't gotten the WrestleMania main event spot yet, especially as in the last few years it's become more commonplace for women to do just this. Sure, she's come close, such as in 2023 when her bout against Charlotte Flair narrowly missed out on going last ahead of Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn versus the Usos, or in 2021 when her and Asuka got pipped to the post by a 3-way between Roman Reigns, Daniel Bryan, and Edge. But close isn't the same as actually reaching the mountaintop. That said, even if Rhea is yet to reach the top of the card on the biggest night of the year for WWE fans, this isn't to say she won't achieve such a goal in the future. No, with her still only being 27 years old, and with her getting more and more over by the day, there's every chance she'll main event WrestleMania multiple times before all is said and done. Seriously, it seems like a given at this point the Australian is going to be the defining female star of her generation, a modern-day Chyna, if you will. And with the possible exception of Becky Lynch, she's got to be the odds-on favorite to be the first woman to main event the biggest show of the year twice, even if she hasn't done it once yet. The only questions left then are when will this happen and who will her opponents be? Will it be at WrestleMania 40 against her rumored opponent that night, the man herself? Or will she have to wait until 2025, where by this point she might get to go up against someone new to the main roster, such as Roxanne Perez or Jade Cargill? It's impossible to say right now, as the headline act of the top show of the year has always been unpredictable. After all, who would have thought that in 2023, despite being heralded by many as the greatest of all time, Ric Flair still wouldn't have achieved the ultimate accolade in WWE? Yes, as probably the most notable example of an all-time legend missing out on the main event spot at Mania, it really is baffling. The Nature Boy never got his flowers in that respect. After all, it's not like he didn't have the perfect opportunity to do so back in 1992. Why was that? Well, even though he spent most of his career in Jim Crockett Promotions and later WCW as the undisputed face of the territories, come that year, issues with management had caused Flair to leave his home of so many years behind and instead jump ship over to Vince McMahon's company. And given the fact that Hulk Hogan was still active at this point then, it made all the sense in the world to book the showdown for the ages between him and the former NWA World Champion for the biggest show on the WWF calendar. Hell, the Nature Boy even had the big gold belt with him when he joined the company, with him at this point proclaiming himself to be the real world champion. And when he won the Royal Rumble in January to snag the vacant WWF title too, there was no longer any dispute about who the best was. All that was left then was for the Hulkster to stand up for the honor of the New York promotion and its fans by sending the Invader packing at WrestleMania 8, but unfortunately, in the end, this didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Well, depending on who you believe, Flair vs. Hogan either didn't draw well enough on the house show circuit, or Vince McMahon had already promised the spot to Sid Justice. So that was why, rather than go on last later in the spring, Flair had to settle for defending the gold against Macho Man Randy Savage in the semi-main event instead. But at least he'd get another chance to headline the big show once he had his second run in WWE years later, right? Not exactly, because by this point, he'd passed the point of being someone who could be put in such a position. No, by then it was all about the likes of John Cena, Triple H, and Dave Bautista. So difficult was it to earn a spot in the main event of WrestleMania during the 2000s and 2010s. In fact, even our next subject was never able to do it. And given the fact that this subject is arguably the greatest luchador of all time, Rey Mysterio, this says a lot. That's right, believe it or not, despite being a 2-decade-long veteran in the Fed, and despite being in multiple world title programs around the time of Mania season, Ray has never actually been able to headline the Showcase of the Immortals. The closest he ever came to this, in fact, was in 2006 at WrestleMania 22 when, after winning the Royal Rumble in honor of his deceased friend Eddie Guerrero, he challenged Kurt Angle for the World Heavyweight title in a bout which also included Randy Orton. Alas though, despite being the sentimental favorite headed into that event, the California native never got the opportunity to go on last, as this spot would be taken up by the WWE title match, pitting John Cena against Triple H instead. And whenever Ray was in a similar main event level program over the years which followed, he'd always be pipped to the post by someone else. Seriously, it didn't matter if he was taking on CM Punk, Cody Rhodes, or even his own son Dominic. The Lucha legend just couldn't get his due by closing out the show. And with his opponent at WrestleMania 40 more than likely being Santos Escobar, it seems unlikely he'll go on last next year either. No, at this point, outside of another huge surge in popularity which sees him go up against Roman Reigns, we really don't see an avenue for Mysterio to ever achieve this goal. But that's not a knock against him, because even if he never main events WrestleMania, Ray remains one of the greatest of all time, if for no other reason than he's given us some of the best matches ever. And more than a few of those came against our next subject as it happened, the fallen friend we alluded to a moment ago, none other than Eddie Guerrero. Sure, had Eddie lived beyond the age of 38, there's every possibility he'd have gone on to headline the biggest show of the year. After all, you could argue that at the time of his passing, he was only just reaching his peak, with this being the point his character work had finally caught up to his in-ring skills. Sadly though, such a thing will never happen now, as with him no longer being with us, there's just no way it ever could. Should he have been given this honor while he was still alive? There's a case to be made for this. Hell, while he might have been more of a mid-carder during his early days with WWF at the turn of the millennium, come the time of his second run beginning in 2002, he was more than ready to be a top-level star. In fact, just 2 years after his return, he'd create one of the all-time feel-good moments in wrestling history when he beat Brock Lesnar to win the WWE title at February 15th, 2004's No Way Out pay-per-view. Just imagine what this moment could have meant then if it had happened just 1 month later at WrestleMania 20. Unfortunately though, WWE chose not to go this direction, instead having that night be main evented by Chris Benoit's big title win, a win which, for obvious reasons, has since been all but erased from history. And with Eddie working the undercard of the grandest stage of them all with Rey Mysterio the following year, and him tragically dying before that year was out, it meant there were no more opportunities for Latino heat to reach that rarefied air so few had reached before him. Yes, after his passing away of a heart attack in November of 2005, Eddie would leave us all to wonder what could have been had he been able to stick around for a little while longer. That said, like with his friend Rey Mysterio, it wasn't as if not main eventing WrestleMania made Eddie Guerrero's career a failure. No, he's always going to go down as one of the greatest of all time regardless. And he's not the only person who was taken away far too soon who never got a chance to go on last on the big stage, because years later, the same thing would happen with Bray Wyatt. And what makes Bray's situation all the more tragic is that there were so many opportunities for him to travel all the way to the top of the mountain throughout his relatively short career. In fact, in a world where the Yes Movement hadn't taken over WWE in the lead up to WrestleMania 30, we could easily see him going on last against John Cena, and even coming out the winner on that occasion. And if not here, he could have also been just as justified in closing out the show with The Undertaker the following year. But the biggest example of Bray getting screwed out of the WrestleMania main event came in 2020, the year the world went into shutdown. As it was then, it looked like a given he was going to be defending his Universal title against Roman Reigns in the lead up to the show. Sadly though, at the last minute, Vince McMahon decided to change plans when he had someone we'll get to in a moment absolutely squash the Florida native 2 months prior at Super Showdown. So because of that then, Bray was left going on second to last on night 2, when in one of the most bizarre and fascinating bouts in WWE history, he took John Cena through a tour of his own mind inside the Firefly Funhouse. Would this have been a better main event than Drew McIntyre's 5-minute win over Brock Lesnar immediately after? In hindsight, it very well may have, especially as the evening before a similar cinematic bout had closed out the evening, but again, we'll get to that in a moment. What we will say for now is that had the Wyatt family leader lived longer, we're sure he would have gotten his big moment in the sun eventually, as even if he did get booked badly at times in the past, he always seemed to be able to rebuild himself using his excellent creative spark. That said, we still wish it could have happened at WrestleMania 36, as there was no reason our next subject had to try and fail to take the spot away from him. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Bill Goldberg? Yeah, to make the whole Super Showdown debacle where Goldberg beat The Fiend to win the Universal title even worse, Bill didn't even get to headline the show when Mania came a couple of months later. No, instead, the Tulsa native had to settle for going on second to last on the first night, as his match against Braun Strowman wasn't deemed a big enough deal for the top spot. But then that's to be fair, because the monster among men was never meant to be in this one. No, it was meant to be Roman Reigns up until the point he pulled himself from the show at the last minute due to safety concerns. And when he did this, the whole thing just didn't have the same luster it had before. Of course, even if Goldberg rightfully got edged out by the Boneyard match between The Undertaker and AJ Styles here, it wasn't like there weren't times he could have easily been in the closing spot over the years prior. After all, in the lead up to WrestleMania 20, his much anticipated bout with Brock Lesnar was expected to steal the show. That was until it was revealed both men would be leaving afterwards, and the entire Madison Square Garden crowd turned on it viciously. So maybe it's for the best this one never main evented either then, but that doesn't mean the eventual rematch between the two in 2017 couldn't have, as this one was far better received, with it being arguably the best sub 5-minute match the company has ever put on. Sadly though, it wasn't meant to be. And with Bill now apparently having left WWE behind for the foreseeable future following the expiration of his last contract, it doesn't look like he's going to have any more opportunities to achieve this goal anytime soon. No, it now looks increasingly like the reality will be once all is said and done, the former WCW champion will go down as one of those unlucky few who came perilously close to going all the way to the top on the grandest stage of them all. But at least he's in good company there because, despite being one of the longest tenured stars to ever appear in Vince McMahon's promotion, Kane was also never able to reach the mountaintop, no matter how hard he tried. And what makes this even harder for fans of Glenn Jacobs to accept is that there was never really a period where it looked like he could have taken the main event spot, as no matter how over he was, there was always someone else at a higher level than him. Take WrestleMania 14, for example, right when he was arguably at his peak. There, the only sensible choice to go on last ahead of him and The Undertaker was Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Shawn Michaels for the world title. Then in 2001, when the Big Red Machine arguably reached his physical zenith, he was once more relegated to the undercard when he got placed in an admittedly fun Hardcore Championship 3-way against The Big Show and Raven, with there being absolutely no chance this was ever going to overshadow the generation-defining battle that was Austin versus The Rock. And after that, Kane started slipping more and more into a utility role position, meaning his chances of headlining the biggest show of the year were now lower than ever. Could he have still done it during the latter half of his WWE run, though? Possibly, if the stars had aligned just right and he'd been given the right opponent. Hell, you could argue his rematch against the Deadman at WrestleMania 20 was the most highly anticipated bout of that night and would have been justified in closing out the show. But alas, it was not meant to be. And with his opponents over the next few years, including the likes of the great Khali, there was even less hope of him snagging the elusive main event spot. And given he's effectively retired from full-time competition at this point, we don't expect to see Glenn Jacobs achieve his goal anytime in the immediate future. Just as we don't expect to see another man he once played take up that position at this stage in his career. Yes, it's time for us to talk about Big Daddy Cool himself, Diesel. Sure, you could argue Kevin Nash really never got much of a chance to main event the Showcase of the Immortals, as he spent most of his peak in WCW, where he was a founding member of the NWO. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a big deal in New York when he was there and perfectly capable of headlining the biggest show of the year. Hell, for a period during the mid-90s, he was the WWF champion. That's right, by the time WrestleMania 11 came around in 1995, Diesel had gone from being a silent bodyguard to the top of the pecking order in the space of only 12 months. So really, there's no reason he shouldn't have been the star attraction here, especially as he was wrestling walking highlight reel Shawn Michaels on this night. But even if Big Sexy was the champ, and the champ had almost always been the headlining act in the past before that, here, he'd ultimately be outshone by a celebrity, as football player Lawrence Taylor got the spot instead when he had his bout against Bam Bam Bigelow. And with that being the only year Nash walked into Mania as the champ, it meant he'd never have as good of a chance to reach that height again as he did on this night. Especially as not long after his showdown with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 12, he'd be gone from the company altogether. Sure, he'd come back again in time for WrestleMania 18 in 2002 after WCW closed its doors once and for all, but let's be real, by this point, he was very much entering the Legends phase of his career and was in no position to be going on last ahead of acts like Triple H, Chris Jericho, Brock Lesnar, or Kurt Angle. Of course, just because Diesel never made it into the closing bout of the biggest show of the year doesn't mean his career was a failure. No, far from it in fact, because he remains one of the most notable figures of his era. And that's something nobody can ever take away from him or anyone else in today's video.